This review was filmed during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, the works being covered here wouldn't exist. I fully support the WGA and SAG-AFTRA in their fight for fair treatment and compensation against a system that continually denies them such. While a full boycott has not been called for, SAG-AFTRA has asked that everyone who does media about film and TV refrain from promoting struck content during this time. From what I can tell based on guidelines they have released, independent reviews do not constitute promotion of a work, but critical assessment of said work of art. Any praise that I give to these works during this video should be seen as praise purely for the artists, writers, and actors who created it. If anything, the praise is emphasizing that the writers, actors, and other artists deserve more compensation because they are who make these works possible. Additionally, this video was not made using any studio-provided screeners or materials. Do not support any studios during the strike. I'm sorry, did I just get a little Deep Space Nine in my Strange New Worlds? Hello, interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and I'm here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, this time Season 2, Episode 8, Under the Cloak of War, and we are staying spoiler-free up front, but as my opening joke sort of illuminated, this was kind of one of the darker episodes of Strange New Worlds that we've gotten so far, very much in the vein of some of the darker episodes of Deep Space Nine. I'm thinking of episodes like In the Pale Moonlight, which fantastic episode, in fact, arguably one of the best episodes of Star Trek overall. But the comparison I'm more making here is that episode ends on kind of a very dark and I don't want to say bleak or dour note, but a little bit more pessimistic than optimistic, which is, where Star Trek usually goes for in the sort of bright, optimistic future. This episode, like Deep Space Nine a lot of the time, or at least some of the time, is a little bit more of a kind of downer ending. And I think this episode earns it really, really well, especially considering the topic that it's dealing with, the traumas of war, and specifically the traumas of the Klingon War as we saw depicted in Star Trek Discovery. And, we saw a little bit of hint of this back at the beginning of the season in the premiere with Chapel and Mbenga, but this episode really goes much further into it, and I like what this episode does on a few different levels. One, it is dealing with stuff from Star Trek Discovery, stuff that kind of got passed over after season 1 ended, and I like that we're kind of dealing with the remnants of that. Two, it allows both Mbenga and Chapel to have a good, strong story. I was worried that Mbenga was going to get overlooked this season. He hasn't had a ton to do this season since the premiere, and I didn't even love the stuff in the premiere, even though this kind of ties into it in a way that I like. And Chapel, while she's gotten a lot to do, has been very much tied to Spock and Spock's character, and I even complained last episode with the Lower Decks crossover that I felt like Chapel was kind of getting pigeonholed as the pining after Spock character. So I liked that this episode, while Spock is involved in her story, is not at all defined by her relationship to Spock in terms of what she's going through this episode, and allowing Chapel to be a little bit more than Spock's girlfriend. So I really, really like it, especially being a woman dealing with trauma from war, which is a storyline you don't often see for women characters in any series. So I did really, really enjoy that aspect of this episode. Like I said, the one thing that I just watched this episode, I'm watching it as it comes out, and so I haven't had time to sit with it a bunch, but my initial inkling on it is, I feel like some people will grumble that this episode is a bit depressing, and I can understand that. That's not always what we come to Star Trek for, is the optimistic show, but as someone who does like Deep Space Nine a lot, and does occasionally like, even my optimism to be tempered with a bit of realism, I guess, or at least an understanding of the arcs that humans go through, I think this episode works really well, even for its sort of bleaker, much more morally ambiguous ending on a couple different levels. And I'm curious to see where they're going to go with this in the future with the manga, because I don't think it ends here. But yeah, this was a very, very difficult one, and I will honestly be very curious to see how this sits with a lot of folks who watch this episode, because I could see people taking it in numerous different ways. For me, though, I ultimately feel like this episode works for me. I liked it quite a bit, actually. I think it's one of the stronger episodes of the season, but I could very much understand why this one would end up being more divisive for other folks. So that's my quick spoiler-free thoughts, but let us get into spoilers to go through this episode. So if you have not watched the episode, jump off here. We start off with a cool ship design. Like they're in the Prospero system. They're picking up this Klingon ambassador, Jagar, I think, Dakra is his name. Sorry, my notes are weird. Klingon names are also strange. Dakra is the ambassador, but the ship that they pick him up from is like this weird like angular ship. I thought it was a cool ship design. I want a model of it. But anywho, they are picking up this ambassador who has sort of been able to negotiate, a lot of treaties between the Federation and and the Klingon Empire since the war. And Pike is trying to like really bring out the red carpet for him, and this reminds me very much of Undiscovered Country, of the resentments that the crew of the Enterprise in that movie, specifically Kirk even had towards the Gowron and Chang in that movie. But here Pike is not playing to Kirk's type. He is playing he's kind of playing Spock's role in that movie, where he is the sort of optimistic, hopeful ones, like I want to work through these things, and it's other characters like Ortegas, as we see in Mbenga and Chapel, that have to work through their prejudices. So I like that we get the whistle and all that stuff, and we get to see that this ambassador Dakra is very deferential to the Federation. He's like, oh, your ships are better, I'm really interested in your culture. He's super deferential to the Federation crew and culture, as a good ambassador kind of should be. And then we jump up to the bridge and we get Uhura and Ortegas, and Ortegas is very clearly holding a grudge against the Klingons. She doesn't really believe him, she doesn't buy him, and ultimately we learn that she's got a decent bead on the guy. But I also like that it does come out of a place of prejudice. I mean, this is something that we've seen with Ortegas' character already, way back in the season 1 finale. Even though that was an alternate future in that finale, we do see she held some prejudices towards the Romulans in that episode. So I like that there is a recurring thread. I don't like Ortegas for it, but I like this recurring thread with her character, that she does sort of harbor a little bit of, underlying xenophobia, not uninformed xenophobia by some sort of level of trauma or pain or fear, but still a xenophobia nonetheless to some degree. And so I like that is actually a thing that, is recurring as the characters, consistent characterization that I think makes her an interesting person, if not, and relatable to a level, even if not always a perfectly morally good character, which I think is great. But the moment that I specifically wanted to call out is I like Pike's sort of disappointed look at Ortegas. And it goes to what we're going to see through this episode. These people want to make this work not for the Klingons' sake, but for Pike's sake. And Pike sort of representing this idealism of Starfleet. So people want to live up to not just Pike, but what Starfleet represents through Pike. And so I like that Pike sort of becoming the humanization of that, and people feeling like we can stand up for that. And I like that this like them disappointing him is symbolism of even kind of disappointing themselves in terms of living up to Starfleet's ideals, but still not being able to fully get over the trauma. It's good using Pike as a symbol of that I really enjoyed. We then cut to the mess hall, where Spock is trying to get Raktajino, nice little reference there. Spock is trying to make everything work. He's trying to smooth everything over, but he can't make it work. And I really like this because it ties into what he tries to do later with Chapel, but he's like trying to smooth over relationships, make everything work, but he can't always stop and fix everything. And the Klingon gets burned, and it brings up some resentments and anger in him. Like it hurts him. And so I like that this Spock trying to make things work ultimately is a recurring motif with his character throughout the episode. We then go to the sick bay, and Mbenga clearly has just very overt trauma stemming from this, not just Klingons overall, but this Klingon specifically, as we'll start to get elucidated throughout the rest of the episode. We come back from the opening credits to flashback sequence, and this was really well done. This was very clearly shot on the video screen wall that they use. I forget what it's called, but basically the video VR wall that they use to film a lot of stuff on. And I've been open about, I don't always, like sometimes I love it, sometimes I don't. I don't always love the big open wide spaces, but here it looked really good in this like oppressive war environment that they're living in. It felt very like just dark and creepy and scary, even though it was a big wide open planet. So I loved the look of this planet. We get to meet the CMO of this MASH unit essentially, and it's Clint Howard. Clint Howard being an actor who goes back all the way to the original series. He was in the episode The Corbomite Maneuver as the baby in that episode, but he's been in numerous series of Star Trek. He was in Deep Space Nine in the episode's past tense. He was in Enterprise as Ferengi. He was in Discovery as well as I think in the season 1 finale of that show as like I think an Orion sort of like a brothel owner. So it's nice to see him here. He might have been in something else too, but those are the ones that immediately come to mind. So nice to see Clint Howard. He's doing a great job here, and just showcasing that this is a really shitty situation that Chapel is entering into as sort of the head nurse. They're really scrounging together, it's very again MASH conditions, triage conditions, and they're doing their best. And so we get to see her working with Mbenga, who also happens to be there. there, and they're helping wounded, and, you know, have to pick and choose who to save. They put a guy in the pattern buffer, and I like that this is kind of a oblong reference to what Mbenga does later on in the series, or later on in his life, what we saw in season 1, where he puts his daughter in the pattern buffer. So he kind of learned that trick from here. So I like that sort of sense of continuity with his character. And we get to see that he is, you know, tying those threads together, trying to save as many lives as they possibly can. He does have a level of hope that they can save people as best they can, but that'll get turned and flipped later on. Just again, I like the nice little like symbolic weavings of these feelings throughout all of these characters. Speaking of which, we then come back to the present, and I love this metaphor that we get of, you know, Mbenga saying he's fixing one of the medical slabs or something like that, medical benches, and it hasn't been working right since the Gorn attack. It's clearly a metaphor for Mbenga's trauma, that even though he's healed it, it's never going to be the same. So I liked that. And I like that Pike comes in and tries to check on Mbenga and says, hey, I'm getting some parsley for dinner tonight. We're all asking everyone to come to the dinner. It's part of, like, Starfleet's mandate to try and heal relationships with the Klingon. But I also understand that it's difficult for you. And I really, again, this sort of idea that people want to live up to Pike. And Mbenga and Chapel both say yes, but it's clear they don't want to. But they're doing it because they wish to live up to Pike's hope for them. Again, I just loving that thread going through here. And I like Pike. It speaks well of Pike that he understands the situation he's putting his crew into and wanting to check on them. They're not being entirely open with him of where they're at, but I like that he is self-aware enough to check on them. It speaks well of him as a leader and as a commander. That's why Pike is one of my favorite captains. So I really enjoy this moment with him, even though ultimately it's going to prove a little bit to blow back on him a tiny bit. And, you know, there's this refrain of "we got this" that Chapel says, that is apparently a refrain that they used when they were sort of dealing with triage, talking about like their trauma and what they used to try and get through the trauma of the events that they're going through and their clear PTSD in the present day, and trying to use that to help them through. But then we meet Mbenga and Ortegas, and Ortegas is very clearly not comfortable. She doesn't buy Ra at all. You know, trying to be like, well, you know, Mbenga argues, well, let's pretend to be Starfleet. Let's put on the face and maybe we'll become that. And it kind of echoes what Boimler was dealing with last episode. Remember where Boimler in the Lower Decks crossover was sort of saying with Pella, like, oh, I'll pretend to be something until I actually am that thing. And so this sort of reflects that, but in a way that's like, can we paper over our traumas? You know, can we try to pretend that they aren't there for just a little bit? And then we get into the dinner, and, you know, Chapel and Mbenga, Ortega show up there. Everyone's trying to smooth it over and go well, but Chapel is clearly bothered. And I like Spock being a supportive boyfriend trying to do something. Spock's a doer. He sees a problem, he wants to fix it. That's his science mind at work. And that doesn't always work with human emotions. So he tries to deflect and change the subject to the art of war and things like that with the Klingon ambassador. But it doesn't really help Chapel demonstrably. And I like that this comes back up later. I'll talk about it now. There's the scene, and this sort of ends Chapel's arc for the most part, where she speaks with Spock and says, you can't always fix things. And Spock's just like, I'm trying to do something, but can't, like, I just have to learn that there's nothing I can do. And that's true. There's nothing you can do. And I like that that's where Chapel's story ends here, because, you know, I think in another show or a lesser show, you get like a scene where Spock makes a grand gesture or has to learn to stay, like, but I like it just ends here where it's just like, there's nothing you can do. And they just need time apart. She needs moments to herself. And sometimes that's all you can do for a person. And just respect what they're asking that they need from you at that time. Show that you're there for them. Show them that you support them, but, you know, you will give them what they want. And if what they want is distance, then you give that to them. So I actually kind of really like the simplicity of that message. It's sometimes something that people need to hear. I needed to hear it a bunch of times. I've had friends who are dealing with PTSD in their own ways. And, you know, you want to help, but ultimately sometimes that impulse is more harmful than helpful. So yeah, because it's not about you. And so I do like those beats. We do, however, as they're talking about the dinner, you know, we sort of get it talking to Gaul, the planet that both Mbenga and Chapel were at, and it's clear that, Dakra is sort of like saying, like, oh, well, I betrayed, they were killing civilians, so I betrayed my own people. That's why I got the butcher. I betrayed my people in order to stop the killings. And so he sort of claimed that as like, oh, I've stopped the civilian killings by betraying my own people. That's why I got the Butcher of Jagal title. And I'm trying to live up to, making amends for the killing of those civilians, trying to make himself look good. essentially. But as we clearly know later on, he's lying about elements of that, but he's still, the guilt is very real, and Ortegas kind of calls him on that. And Ortegas gets up and leaves. And I like Pike checking in on Mbenga during this session, making sure he's doing good, and all of that stuff, and saying, hey, go check on Ortegas when she leaves. We also get a couple moments where, in the past, where Mbenga meets this patient, who, is just like, I wish I was Starfleet again. I wish I was here to explore, not fight a war. And Mbenga tries to talk him in. He's like, this is what we need to do. We need to fight the Klingons. It needs to be done. And because of that ensign kind of gets inspired to go be in a Black Ops battle and get killed by said Klingons. And Mbenga clearly feels a level of guilt for inspiring that in this ensign. And just how war makes everyone complicit in some way or form, and it inspires Mbenga to use his Black Ops skills to be able to break in and go after the Klingon leadership on Dagall. One thing I will say here too, it is a little bit convenient that Mbenga has these good Black Ops skills that we've never heard of before. And I know it ties into the drug at the beginning of the season. What's interesting to me is we did get that, now that I'm thinking about it, it's I was really excited when I saw this episode coming up and that we were going to deal with some of that drug use, because they'll make that use of that super fighty drug that we got in the season premiere make much more sense in retrospect. Because I didn't really like the let's go and punch Klingons bit of the season premiere. I was like, okay, at least this episode kind of smoothed it over. But the drug that Mbenga uses there gets mentioned that he created it and he was able to use it, but it doesn't really become plot pertinent. So I still can go back to that premiere and be like, well, this was dumb. I didn't need this drug use. I don't mind it being a setup for Mbenga has trauma towards Klingons, but it's weird. Like that element of that premiere I liked. I don't mind Mbenga having a bit of trauma from war. It was just the clear, let's have action punchy fights by giving Mbenga a super drug sort of thing. I was hoping that it would make much more sense with this episode, but it still feels superfluous and unnecessary. So frankly, that's a little bit of a disappointment. That's not this episode's fault. That's premiere's problem. It does get explained in this episode a little bit more, which makes it a little bit better, but still feels superfluous to get to an action beat in the premiere. That's just my quick take on it, because I don't think it's needed, frankly. I think his own personal trauma is enough, and he's not that addicted to the drug. If it was a drug addiction problem, maybe you could tie that in with trauma and trying to self-medicate sort of thing, but it's still not. It's not really brought up too much in that context here in this episode all that much. So yeah, frankly, I just don't think it was needed. We come back to the present, though, and, we get the scene with Chapel and Spock that I already referred to. We get a quick scene between Klingon, Dakra, and Mbenga, who are doing judo together. We learned that the Klingon is just hey, it would be a great thing if we, as two veterans of the war, work together to try to smooth things over. It would be a great symbol. And he wants to sort of try to heal over the wounds by sort of uniting with Mbenga. And Mbenga sort of says, well, I need to know things about you, who fought and we learned that Dakra is claiming that he, betrayed his own people to stop the killing of civilians, which we ultimately learn is not true. And Mbenga calls him out on this a little bit. It's who fought the hardest? And Dakra makes up a story, as we later learn, and says this guy did. And again, he's trying to make himself look good and dealing with his own guilt by using a lie of accountability and change. And we get a sonic shower scene where we learn Mbenga. Cool to see the sonic shower, by the way. Mbenga goes in and tries to create a Black Ops thing and go and kill the Klingons. Then we come back to the present, and we have Mbenga being met by Dakra again, and Dakra says, "Hey, come with me," and Mbenga's like, "Just leave me alone. I don't want to do this." But then it turns out Mbenga reveals what I've been alluding to this whole time, is that he was the butcher. He was the one that killed those Klingons, and that Dakra lied and claimed that he killed them in order to, seem like he had done some good to atone, that he had done more than he actually had done to change his ways during the war instead of after the war, as we see now. And this gets into a conversation about, well, we'll get there. I'll end on this discussion. But it leads to a fight, and we don't ultimately learn who started the fight, if it was Dakra or Mbenga, and it's left ambiguous. Chapel, I think she saw. It was kind of shot a little weirdly, by the way. I felt like she was in another room, and then it turns out she was in there. So she saw the full wonderful thing, but it was just, the editing was a little wonky for me. But neither here nor there. I figured it out. And Chapel states that it was, the Klingon who started the fight, Dakra, but Mbenga, again, it's left ambiguous whether that is actually the truth. And Pike goes and sees Mbenga and says, hey, if this is the case, I trust you, but, you can come to me if it was different. And Mbenga doesn't say anything, but he sort of argues that, hey, he was living a lie, and he murdered children, he murdered civilians, and he never actually atoned. And Pike says, well, who gets to decide that? We have tribunals, we have people to do that. We don't just, kill people willy-nilly, and who gets redemption. And Pike, and Mbenga calls out, like, Pike's the symbol of redemption, the best of Starfleet. And Mbenga gets to believe what he sees as the truth is that some people can't be atoned for. And this gets ultimately to the theme of the episode, why I kind of like the moral ambiguity, is because he's not also talking about Doctor, he's talking about himself. He's talking about, like, the things that he got that changed him during the war, and the deaths that he had to be complicit in. Because there was also that death of that person, the transporter, that he had to let die to save others. And how war makes everyone complicit, war traumatizes everyone, war makes everyone do horrible things and changes you. And he's not just saying, this Klingon didn't seek atonement, but Mbenga hasn't really fought for atonement for the things that he's done. So he's speaking as much about himself as for others. And I really, like I said, this is a very sad and kind of depressing and dour and even partially, arguably pessimistic ending for an episode of Star Trek overall. But I hope that this arc gets picked up and continued in future seasons. But I do really like this discussion about, like, what does it mean to atone? What does it mean to hold yourself accountable? Did this Klingon Dakra hold himself accountable, or was he just lying to get accountability, like lying to try and make himself look good? Was his work that he was doing still holding himself accountable? Was it worth the fact that he himself didn't do these things? Like, it's a complicated situation that I would actually have to sit down and think more about, because I just watched the episode. But I think it's an interesting question. And one that I think that this episode is sort of like, by being morally ambiguous, about whether or not Mbenga killed the man or not who started the fight, it's sort of asking us this question, like, should Mbenga be accountable? What does accountability mean? How do you do that? What's right, what's wrong? And how war will stick with you and change you no matter what. I frankly thought it was an interesting ending, one that raises some interesting questions that I don't think there are any specific real answers to. I tend to lean towards the side of, the more optimistic, like Pike potentially, but, Mbenga's not entirely wrong either. So, like I said, I had to sit down and rewatch this episode to give a deeper reading of it. I'm sure there's much more I could think about or talk about, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts in the comments on this. But it's an interesting ending, and again, one that I ultimately liked and found intriguing. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this episode. I really liked this one. I can understand if it ends up being divisive for people, but I thought it was an interesting rumination on trauma and accountability and pain. I loved what it did for Chapel and Mbenga, and sort of complicating those characters in interesting ways, and letting the episode end in a ways that doesn't resolve anything. Not just for Mbenga, but for Chapel as well. There's not easy resolutions to these things, nor should there be. And I thought that was a really intriguing way to go with these characters. So that's my thoughts on episode 8 of this season. What did you think, though? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.